Hello, everyone. I'm Mark Overmyer-Velazquez, a professor of history and Latin American studies at the University of Connecticut. It's my pleasure to be part of this panel, and thanks to Ben for organizing and to Adam and Laura for sharing their excellent papers. I'll start with some general comments and then move into a couple of questions for each of the papers presented. In general, I was very pleased to listen to the papers as part of a coherent approach to thinking about new scholarship, both in U.S. Mexican immigration history, also in Mexican history, and thinking about the ways that the Mexican government, both kind of the federal level and local levels, are involved and have been involved in this larger history of migration between the two countries. And with that in mind, it's really exciting to hear the presentations as part of larger works that are kind of correctives to what have long been more unilateral histories, and thinking about the multi-bilateral international perspectives to this. Of course, in Adam's case, shedding light on the little acknowledged power of the administrative mechanisms of control in the United States. Also, I think this research highlights the fact that new archives are being used, like the Investigaciones de Políticas y Sociales, and new readings of old archives, both in Mexico, Mexico City, and states, and also in the United States. I think there's some really exciting theoretical interventions here, more nuanced theoretical framings of state power, systems of control, of migrant agency, new terms or kind of renovated terms around domestic deportability, revisiting this notion of voluntary deportations, and then, of course, highlighting the seemingly mundane but ultimately very powerful and consequential role of administrative removals versus what is typically more seen, certainly in the popular press, but also in the literature around kind of more visible, legible, forced expulsions. More broadly, also, I think the papers collectively help point a way to a more kind of complicated role of Mexico in these histories, moving away from a monolithic narrative of U.S. control and Mexican complicity. They show how larger economic forces, labor demands, and international pressures in both the U.S. and Mexico shaped and altered these histories in different ways across the 20th century. And all shed light on the contemporary relevance of the work. That is, the current state of deportations and other forms of immigrant labor controls have long iterative histories that have their own logics and trajectories. Similarly, that in order to disrupt and dismantle these impressive systems, we need to learn from the work of these outstanding scholars, all the more so in the present day. So a couple of questions to each, and it'll be brief. First to Ben Montoya and his paper, The Quality of Free Man, National Sovereignty as a Bar to Equality of Peoples. Again, an excellent review of the kind of multilateral international impacts and discussions that are taking place during the period in question. My question was about imperialism and why, Ben, you did not decide to use kind of discussions of imperialism as part of the framing of your paper. There's no discussion of the kind of anti-imperialist rhetoric, for example. You speak of, quote, the Latin American view of how Anglo-European capitalist systems should be maintained. And is this was the language used, or was this a proxy that was used for kind of the anti-imperialist internationalist perspectives that were certainly alive and well during this period? For example, you also mentioned the context of Teddy Roosevelt, one of the sort of course, staunch advocates of U.S. imperialism. So in other words, could there be more theoretical framing here that would help kind of connect your work to larger other literatures that are very much engaged with this notion of imperialism, global South, solidarity, in the kind of inchoate stages in the period you're discussing. To Adam's piece, a section from his new book that I look forward to getting my hands on, The Deportation Machine. How and is focused on Operation Wetback. How did the Operation Wetback shape INS practices into the future? Was this sort of a pivotal moment? What was the relationship with the Bracero program and this and the operation? How did this massive wave of deportation shape the Bracero program? In other words, how does that 1954 moment help us to understand the origins and development of these administrative practices of deportation that are so dominant today? And finally, a question for Laura and her work, Secret Deportations and Managed Labor. There was a moment when you managed that when deportees are coming back into Mexico, there's a confirmation of their nationality when being processed. And although this is prior, that is in the 70s, prior to the beginning of the major wave of Central American refugees and migrants coming in the 80s, I wondered if this was a moment where there were some lessons learned that you found in the IPS secret police reports that ultimately would lead to what is the kind of current state of Mexico as a buffer, as its own kind of border nation between the U.S. and Central America. In other words, what is the role of Central America, Central Americans in this history of deportation, deportability? And finally, you mentioned that there was a deliberate occlusion by the Mexican government of this forced movement of deported laborers. And there's a brief mention of the press, but I'm wondering what the role here is of the press. Did the government, what role did the government have in suppressing or colluding with the press to silence this history, and why? Anyway, those are just some brief questions in this brief time that I have to respond, but I so look forward to learning more from the larger works as they come out into the world, published or in other conferences. I look forward to seeing you all in person in the near, not so distant future. Anyway, take care, and again, thank you for this opportunity.